Because I know I mentioned to some of you, Matt has to go back and forth for VBS to be Zacchaeus tonight, so. And I want to know why they didn't find some short little person to be Zacchaeus instead of you, but you know, that's a whole other subject. Christian could have been Zacchaeus. Okay, so let's see if I can make this all work, guys.
About what we have professed to want to do, and that is to become an anti-racist church, a work that we will continue in for as long as it takes, and it will take a long time. I want to get down to the conversation. Is that okay?
Can you all hear that?
Welcome, Dr. Kendi.
Welcome.
You are in a room of your closest, most intimate friends and supporters.
All right. I don't get that a lot.
And we are so honored and excited that you decided to join us. We had questions prepared. If we could keep it as quiet as we can. Thanks. We had questions prepared. And as always, life happens and we want to open with a kind of different question. Given the recent decisions by the Supreme Court around striking down affirmative action, and then today rescinding the ability for people to be free of crushing student loan debt, as well as rendering a decision that would say that everyone's freedoms are not equal in this country and everyone is not entitled to the same type of treatment. Given these decisions have just come down in the last 2 days, and your work is around helping us eliminate some of these biases and bigotries, we would love to hear from you, whatever comments you have to make on that.
Well, I think I want to speak specifically about the affirmative action decision, and then speak more broadly about a few of these decisions, as well as even the decision last year that struck down Roe. I think it's important for us to understand that a century ago, I think it's probably difficult for some of us to imagine that a century ago, many Americans were imagining that Mississippi schools were separate but equal. I suspect it may be difficult for some of us to imagine how the court could allow such massive inequities in school funding for so long on the premise that the inequities didn't exist and that the schools were separate but equal. I'm mentioning this because, as I wrote recently in The Atlantic, race neutral is the new separate but equal. And what I mean by that is there's this perception that affirmative action is a so-called race-based or race-conscious policy that is, quote, discriminatory, particularly against white and Asian students. And there's this perception that the other admission metrics are, quote, race neutral. This is a fantasy.
Yes.
As much of the fantasy that when the court consistently, a century ago, ruled that desegregation efforts were either harmful or not needed because the funding was equal. Similarly, when you actually look at the admission metrics, you find that legacies provide racial preferences to white students. You find that standardized tests do not actually predict the success of students in college or even in graduate school, but they do typically predict the wealth or income of the parents of the test takers. And we have a massive racial wealth gap in this country. And those who have higher wealth are able to spend a lot of money on high-priced test prep courses, which are marketed to boost the scores of their kids. And so we wonder why kids who come from richer families are getting higher tests. It's not because they're intellectually superior, it's because they have more resources. And we also know that most colleges are providing boosts for the kids of employees, and most colleges have all sorts of disparities. In other words, white people are disproportionately likely to be on staffs and faculties at highly selective colleges, so which means that their kids are more likely to receive boosts in admissions. We also know that white people, because they have higher levels of wealth, are more likely to be able to provide donations to colleges. And if you're a relative of a donor, you also get a boost. We also know that if you're an athlete, then you also get a boost. And most athletes are actually not playing basketball and football. And most of those athletes not playing basketball or football are white. And most of those non-revenue generating sports take a lot of resources to actually play at a high level. So that's another area in which white students are getting racial preferences. But these people who claim they are against racial preferences, these people who claim they want to create equality, didn't go after those admission metrics. They went after the only admission metrics, which is a minor admission metric compared to those that actually benefits people of color. On the premise that those admission metrics are race neutral. And they're laughing in our face. In the same way the court laughed in our face when they claimed schools in the South that were segregated were equal. And so that's why race neutral is the new separate but equal. And I'll also say that in studying the history of racism, what I find consistently is those who are producing racist ideas, those who are instituting or conserving racist policies, are typically also producing sexist ideas, are typically also defending sexist policies, are typically also producing homophobic ideas and policies, are typically also producing policies that harm working people, that people who are defending bailouts for big banks and business owners, but then claiming that people who have everyday student debt shouldn't get bailout. These are the same people. And so what I'm ultimately saying is that it is not a coincidence that the very justices who are ordering forced births are also stating it's legit and legal to have straight-only businesses. That those same justices are also denying people from getting student loan debt. That those same justices are also stating that those policies that are leading to racial equity are actually the bad ones. And the policies that are leading to racial inequity in college admissions, we need to ban. It's not a coincidence. Bigots have always, racism has always reinforced sexism. Sexism has always reinforced homophobia. Homophobia has always reinforced classism. So that's why when we're fighting racism, we can't fight racism with the tunnel vision. We have to recognize the ways in which these other bigotries are reinforcing racism, just as racism racism or reinforcing these other behaviors.
I appreciate the truth and the passion of what you're saying. And I'm going to ask a question that may not even have an answer. And now what? This is the Supreme Court. Elections have consequences. And now what?
Well, I think that two things. First, continuing on from my last conversation, we have to build solidarity across these different dignitaries, right? So these bigots, as I mentioned, those Supreme Court justices who are seeking to conserve homophobia and racism and sexism and classism, they're in solidarity, right? So we who are opposed to those things must be in solidarity too. We have long, of course, we're in a moment in which we have a very strong and burgeoning anti-racist movement. We have a strong and burgeoning feminist movement. We have a strong and burgeoning movement for queer people's rights. We have a strong and burgeoning movement for workers. Look at all the ways in which we're unionizing across this country. But are we building links and solidarity between those movements? That's what's critical in this moment.
Thank you for that call and challenge to us. You've been doing something recently, the last couple of years, with your work. That also speaks to part of the conversation we're having tonight about raising anti-racist children. While the Moms for Liberty and other so-called parents' rights groups have been organizing in public school board meetings to keep social emotional wellness programs away from our young people, to keep culturally relevant pedagogy away from our young people, and to keep gender-friendly care away from our young people. You've been translating at breakneck speed, you've been translating your scholarly work into media directed for young people. Graphic novel with stamped from the beginning. Anti-racist baby, goodnight racism. Why have you been working so hard to translate these ideas to young people while others have been working so hard to keep history and these ideas away from them?
Well, I think you certainly answered it. And I would just also add that, as we've seen, even in this state, as in other states, that young people, children, are being harmed by these policies, right? Children are being harmed by the fall of Roe, right? Children are being harmed by racism. You're going to have young people, black kids, who are going to apply for college and get denied and think it's because there's something wrong with them as opposed to those admission policies, right? And so first and foremost, even though we like to imagine that our young people are too young to be faced with racism, it's just simply not true. And I also think it's important, like when we think about our children, we're thinking about people of color are thinking about their own children, their own students. And when I say their children, I'm not just talking about their biological children, their nephews, right? Others, their nieces, their grandkids. They may remember that time when that child came home and said, I want to be white. Or that child came home and said, I don't like the texture of my hair. Or I don't like the way my eyes are shaped. Or I don't like my skin color. Like, that's happening. And so what that means is that that child is being inundated And so we have to protect them. We have to actively teach them that your skin color, the shape of your eyes and your nose and your lips and the texture of your hair is beautiful. It's just as beautiful as any other texture. Because if we're not actively teaching them that, then it's equivalent to literally allowing them to walk across a highway. They're going to get hit. Right? And so for me, knowing that, and then knowing that they're vulnerable to these ideas, and they're the people we're the least likely to engage with them. No, I mean, I'm tired. I love kids too much. And this isn't just about, obviously, kids of color. This is about white kids too. You have white kids who are saying directly and indirectly that I'm not just special when I'm kind, but I'm special because I'm white. Right. And they're learning that. They're looking at their curriculum and they're seeing that people who look like them are dominating their curriculum. That's telling them who they should value because the people who are selecting their curriculum are telling them who they should value. And then not only that, you have white kids who have social media accounts and who are being targeted online by white supremacist organizations with all sorts of sexist and racist and anti-Semitic and homophobic ideas. And if we haven't taught them those ideas so they can recognize them and protect themselves from those ideas, then what's going to happen? They're going to be harmed by those ideas too. You have white parents all over this country who are shocked because their kids are reading about Nazism. They're like, where did this come from? Right? And the last thing I'll say about the so-called Moms for Liberty, which we know black folks know them as Daughters of the Confederacy. They claim, right, using dog whistles, they claim to actually care about white kids. That's their pitch. We care about white kids. So then why aren't they protecting white kids from these ideas? Why aren't they protecting white kids from assault rifles? Why aren't they taking assault rifles out of those kids' hands? So they're allowing white kids to both have these bigoted ideas and these assault rifles. And they're allowing them to come to schools with other white kids, because this is a segregated nation. Right? And what do you think is going to happen? And then they claim to care about white kids. We know they don't care about kids of color, but it's a lie that they care about white kids.
So I want to go somewhere for a very personal reason, because my role here is to help facilitate the justice ministries of the United Church of Christ. And I warned you about this backstage, so be gentle with me on this, okay? Often, I will hear repeated in the church, well, Ibram Kendi says everybody can be racist. And it becomes, I need you to help me with that. While I understand the practice of identifying behaviors as racist or anti-racist, and I want to stop here to commend you, because those of you who have read aloud with us about ableist language. And he takes the time not just to change the language, but to highlight what has been changed, and then put a footnote at the bottom as to why it has been changed. So in this particular book, he says, before I used the word crazy, and I use that word because racist language is my area. I'm still growing in ableist language. But here's the thing, now that I know better, I'm going to do better. So I'm rereading the new version, and I'm understanding better what you mean when you say that everyone can be racist. I do believe that within all of us there is good and evil, and we choose every day, and sometimes we choose badly. But what I'm wrestling with is all of our racist practices do not have equal impact in this world. And I want you to talk a little bit about that. I can remember as a little girl in the 4th grade was the first time I was called a nigger. And I didn't grow up with that word. I didn't even know what it meant, but I knew by the way it came out of his mouth. Another 4th grader. I was the only black in the class. It was my first day. I knew the way he called me a nigger, that it was something I wouldn't want to be. And so I reached into my memory to my father, who also had words he used when he was mad at people that looked like this boy. And without knowing what it meant, with all the venom I could conjure up, I said, "You Peckerwood." Two kids. Peckerwood didn't seem as harmful though as nigger, but I'm just gonna say, 2 kids mimicking what we learned. And it would be funny, except the next day when I went to chapel for the first time, I learned that the priest was his father. I wrestled with not having a delineation between the impact of systematic racism and me saying Peckerwood. Can you help me with that?
Well, I think it's important for us to first distinguish between the term racism, which indeed is structural, and the term racist, which is a term that describes, or we can use for an individual person, or even an individual idea, or even an individual policy. Historically, people have said that black people can't be racist, which, again, if we understand racism as structural, we will understand that that even terminology doesn't make much sense. So the way I would remix that, is to say that a particular group, whether black people or another group, can participate in a structure, can defend a structure. But it's different when we're talking about an individual. So the question for the individual is, am I, as an individual, upholding or challenging the structure? The question for the group, a group of people are actually engaging in defending policies, creating ideas that are substantiating those policies. And I would argue that historically black people, and to a certain extent other groups of color, have been engaging in anti-racism. When you actually look at their history, when you actually look at their presence, black people have been engaging, generally speaking in anti-racism. Now, but that doesn't mean all black people have been.
Say that.
So, there was an individual who in the spring of 1968, black students engaged in a tremendous amount of activism at the College of Holy Cross. And through their activism, they were able to force the college to bring in an unprecedented number of black students the fall of 1968. And one of those students would join the BSU, would later become alienated from the BSU, would go on to Yale Law School through an affirmative action program. Then he would leave. He benefited from the anti-racist activism.
You're not playing fair, but go ahead.
Then he benefited from the affirmative action program at Yale. So these actions and policies allowed him to rise up the ladder, right? Then he said, when he left Yale and he left the College of the Holy Crosses, he didn't rise up the ladder higher up than other black people because of the activism and the affirmative action policy. It was because he was superior to those other black people. He worked harder than those other black people. If only they would take, and we're in the 1980s, personal responsibility like I did. Right, and then he joins and leads a federal agency under Reagan, uses his power to reduce significantly the number of anti-racist cases that are actually won. Then he benefits from that. You know, the white supremacist establishment is like, whoa, this guy is using his power to harm black people. Let's promote him. So then he is nominated for the Supreme Court after being a judge for only 13 months. So clearly he was mediocre at best. But he told himself he got that job not because of his blackness and willingness to step on the heads of black people for white people. No, he got that job because he was better than black people. And then he climbed up to the Supreme Court, and for the last 40 years, he's used every opportunity to strike down the anti-racist policies that propped him up. And claimed that, they should just work as hard as me. I'm describing a scenario. And this is an individual, right, who has benefited from his refusal to challenge the structure, and if anything, has benefited from reinforcing the structure of racism, all the while articulating racist ideas to explain the inequality that persists because of the structure of racism.
Okay, there's one black person that can be racist.
Let's talk about other races. Let's talk about
that's okay.
I can talk about Nikki Haley. I can talk about Ted Cruz.
So rather than run down the list.
But let me just say one thing. I don't necessarily, though, think that white people should use what I'm saying as a weapon against people of color. Because it's like, I'm not saying that for white people to use as a weapon for people of color. I'm saying that so that people of color can recognize someone like Clarence Thomas as racist.
I do want to, I want to go back to Holy Cross and not for him. I want to go back to Holy Cross because college campuses are a current site of struggle. From the previous conversation about affirmative action to the references to the student loan debt forgiveness and standing in the way of that same court with that same aforementioned gentleman. And the actions of the College Board to affirm that other people's history is worthy of study, but Black students' history is not. Your early scholarship focused on the Black campus movement and its agency and power in transforming higher education, introducing Black studies departments across the country, and shifting the construction of faculties at institutions, elite, so-called, selective, and even some of our HBCUs and MSIs, minority serving institutions. Considering that scholarship, what lessons might we learn either about the agency, about the approaches, about the capacity of students on campuses to react and to respond to what we hear from the Supreme Court now and from what we're seeing from the College Board as well?
I mean, to me, there's so many lessons to be learned by that generation of students. And, you know, to even add more to what you stated about their achievements. Between 1965 and 1972, which was the period of the Black campus movement, where you had all these Black students who were organizing VSUs or taking over SGAs, particularly at HBCUs, they were able to quadruple the number of Black students during that period. The percentage of Black faculty went from 0.1% in 1967 to 4.5% by the mid-1970s. When they started their movement in 1965, there was no such thing as Black Studies. There was no Black Studies department. There was no Black Studies program. Even HBCUs typically had a single course on Negro history or a single course on Negro literature. And so what we now know as Black Studies simply didn't exist, and students came up with Black Studies themselves, not Black faculty. Black Studies was a student idea. And at most colleges, it was students who had to go before all white faculties and administrators to justify Black Studies, because there was no Black faculty around, right? So they had to get in intellectual battles with people twice and three times their age to justify the need for Black Studies. And, you know, these students also conceived of what is now known as the diversity office or officer, or even the diversity statement. Like, these were all conceptions that these students organized, you know, and demanded for. So to me, I hope people glean from those achievements the power and the ability and the brilliance of students, of young people, if we only just get out of their way.
I'm not sure this happened, so I want to check. Do you have index cards at your tables to write questions on? That did not happen? Okay. So let me ask this question. I want to link what you just said about students to the church. We are a predominantly white denomination, and not because we desire to be so, but that is who we are. And I'm intrigued by what you said about the students themselves calling to question. So you are here as a guest of our current work in terms of our denominational campaign, Join the Movement. I want to make sure you look at that website. It is phenomenal and has all kinds of information there. Dr. Velda Love leads that work, and Dr. Sharon Finema. accompanies her in that. So what would you imagine, because I know that you're also formed very heavily by your faith and in your faith as being brought up that way, what might you imagine we need to say to the church in terms of understanding the complexities of being multicultural, a multiracial church, while we are yet 84% white? How do we become a church that is led by those few towards really grasping what it means to be anti-racist?
Well, let me just first state that I think it is critically important for the church to be guided in this ministry by a liberation theology as opposed to a savior theology. And just so we're clear on the distinction between liberation theology and what I call in my work savior theology. Liberation theology presupposes that Jesus first was a revolutionary, and Jesus came to inspire the people to revolt and transform their conditions and to liberate themselves from the clutches of oppression. And the job of the church, is to serve as one of those meeting places, or the main meeting place for that revolt, for that revolution against oppression. And that the job of the Christian is to be consistently inspired by the revolutionary example, of Jesus. As J. Cole defined a Christian as one who is striving for liberation. Now, savior theology presupposes that Jesus came to save the people from their uncivilized, undeveloped, backward ways. And that the job of the church and church leaders, and in this case the church majority, is to, quote, develop and save these people from themselves.
Yes.
That the church is supposed to be the civilizing agent of the people. That the people, in this case, white people, need to save people of color. Not join with people of color to liberate themselves from the shackles, of racism. So if you have a church that's 84% white, and those white folks imagine themselves as saviors, then you're certainly not going to have an anti-racist church. And let me also add that the conservators of racism have long preached a savior theology. Because it lends itself. It allows white Americans who are bringing in people of color to civilize and develop them to believe that they're actually doing something.
Well,
That they're actually civilizing a people who's already civilized. And so I just think that it's critically important, for this movement to be based truly in a liberation theology. And if it's not, then I can imagine the difficulty and challenges, of those folks of color, those few folks of color, because they're coming into the church just as equal as anyone else, and people are looking at them as if they need to be saved. No, I don't need to be saved by you. You ain't any better than me.
I want to say that I believe the United Church of Christ to be a church that's trying to be anti-racist. And yet, we are still evolving around that. Because we all come not with a blank slate, but with all of our histories and our experiences, etc. But I asked you that question because I caution against it being just a statement to make, or some declaration we sign and now we're done. the journey to anti-racist for all of us, I believe, is a journey that will take our entire lifetime. And that's why I appreciate so much you taking the time in your book to talk about how you are changing and how you are taking this journey as an invitation to us to never think we know it all and we've got it all right.
Yeah.
And if I could just add very quickly, I think, as you mentioned that, to be more specific about the way Savior theology operates in society and even in the church, it largely operates through assimilationist ideas. So when we think of a religion, right, a religion is a focal point of culture. And assimilationist ideas have long stated that the cultures of white people are not only superior, but they're the standard. And assimilationists have historically made the case that black people or brown people or indigenous people can be civilized, can reach the pinnacle of white culture. And so then white assimilationists have long went about trying to, for first imagining that people of color are culturally deprived and seeking to impose their culture from a deeply mission, like they're on a mission, to do so. And obviously that's created all sorts of problems. And I think even as it relates to Christianity, what many white folks don't want to accept is that black folks have created their own Christianity.
That's right.
Yeah.
Right.
Right, and so if you go to a black church, predominantly black church, there's a reason why the Holy Ghost is elevated in sort of religious practices, because that connects with traditional African religions where ghosts and spirits and the mounting of people is actually a profound element. And so I don't think that people have recognized the genius that particularly black folks have had. Like, they literally were forced in many cases to practice Christianity. So they were like, okay, this is the box that I have to practice religion in. Okay, I'm going to bring my religion and reshape that box.
Yeah.
So I'm going to send you home with a new book called The Fifth Stream. I'm just going to leave it right there.
And I just want to mention this because, so then when those folks are operating in a majority white space, instead of accepting that different way of practicing and believing, people are asked to conform. And I don't think people understand that request or demand to conform is an assimilationist request, which makes it a racist request.
I would add to that, I'm sorry, Stars, get down and shut up. I would add to that in my opinion, in progressive space, what that ends up looking like is creating policies and systems and structures that allow us to perpetuate racism while claiming to be the victim of it as well. So the system and the policies are things that we can't change. It's just what we have to live with, as though systems are inanimate objects, as though policies are inanimate objects, as though they did not come about because there are people who are creating them and who are supporting them and undergirding them. And so now in progressive faith, I can pretend I can't do anything about it because this is what the system says, which is also racist.
Because it conserves racism.
So you stumbled into that word I wanted to get to. Because we talk about theology. and you talked about religion, and then you dropped faith. I want to push the difference and invite you to testify a little bit. There's this guy by the name of Christopher Rufo. He writes for the New York Post, conservative columnist, who, in what I think he meant as an insult to you, called you a false prophet of a dangerous faith. And I know a few people here who I think practice a pretty dangerous faith. I want you to talk a little bit about, and again, I make this distinction, theology. I think we do theology well. I was trained at UCC Seminary.
Shout out to UCC.
I think we do religion well. The structures, the liturgies, the strictures, the restraint, the cultural elements.
Talk about it.
Faith is something else.
Yeah.
A deep trust. And you are doing, regardless of what Rufo says about prophecy, you are doing the dangerous work. How does your faith inform and undergird you in doing this dangerous work?
Well, just to put what this person said in context. So when you can't win an argument with someone, you essentially dismiss them. Right. So being a scholar who writes books and cites every claim I make, which is to say I speak from the research, which is what scholars do. If you can't combat that research, if you can't combat that scholar, then you say, oh, he's actually not a scholar at all. Like he's a prophet. And indeed, not only did Rufo make this case, but even a black guy named John McWhorter wrote a book called Woke Racism, in which he argued that I and Nicole Hannah-Jones and Ta-Nehisi Coates, we were not intellectuals, we were not thinkers, that we were pushing a religion, a cult, so that people wouldn't read our work, so they would dismiss it, because they knew that if they read our work, then they would find out that McWhorter is actually the second black racist. And so, but in terms of your so that's actually what's happening. It's part of this larger effort to completely delegitimate and delegitimize. So, and that's really what happened. So after 2020, they spent the first 2 years or so trying to delegitimate us. Then that didn't work. So then they started banning our books. They have because they don't want people to take us seriously. They don't want people to read our work because they know what's going to happen. Right? So all they can do is delegitimate us and ban us. But to your question, so as some of you may know, both of my parents were and still are ministers. My parents joined the ministry in the AME Church. Actually, my parents met at Urbana 70. Anybody may have heard of the famous Urbana 70 conference where about 10,000 Christians descended on Urbana, Illinois, including about 250 black Christians who took over the conference and welcomed a black liberation theologian by the name of Tom Skinner to speak. And in his speech, he talked about the liberator, meaning Jesus, has come. So that's how my parents met. And they, of course, in many ways, raised me in that liberation faith. But I think another faith that they raised me in that I think is almost sort of blends the spiritual and the secular is this sort of incredible belief that we can overcome. And I don't know whether it's sort of ancestral because, you had enslaved Africans who believed that the day of Jubilee would come, or those black folks who were meeting in the church every night in Montgomery, Alabama, singing into existence the success, of their boycott, what. But they have just instilled in me this incredible faith. I can remember the day that I was diagnosed with cancer, with colon cancer, and I had a lunch date with my mother, and after I received the diagnosis, we met up with my mother, and I shared with her, I've been diagnosed with cancer. And she looked at me and said, we're going to deal with this. And you could see the faith
Yes.
right in her eyes,
Yes.
which instilled a faith in me.
Yes.
And I think it's that faith that causes me to believe that the forces of justice will win.
Yeah.
Yes. On that note, I think we'll close. That the forces of justice will win. That by faith, we'll have an answer to what now. I am encouraged by you, Dr. Kennedy. I have deep respect for you, even though we're going to go back and forth about that racist. And I want to mention in this space that I know that you are also the product of many things, but a historically black university is one of them. So I believe some of the answer is for us also to fight that those institutions don't go away. Because the truth is, the bastion of black brilliance has never been in the PWI. I'm praying for that. Bella, you want me to risk asking somebody to ask a question? Why don't you ask a question?
Could you provide a final word for the young people here? I was going to ask if one young person under 18 had a question for you. And so how to raise anti-racist children is important for us as people of faith. And what would your words be, or word, for the young people sitting here to not give up on faith, but to believe that the sacred is still speaking even to them?
And to extend that, I would say to young people that part of my faith, that the forces of justice will win, is because of my faith in young people. Now, the older folks, because when we look at this nation's history, right, you know who is in the forefront of fighting against enslavement?
That's right.
It was young people. Right? They built the abolitionist movement. Right? Do you know who was at the forefront of both the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement? It was young people. Even, of course, we talk a lot about the civil rights movement, but the Black Power movement,
Yes.
which of course the premier Black Power organization was the Black Panther Party.
That's right.
The average age of a Black Panther Party member was 19 years old. Like, these were young people, right? Who, and the reason I think that
that young people, one of the many reasons why young people have been at the forefront of our movements is because of their courage. And it seems as if the older we get, the less courage we have. And if anything, we are imposing our lack of bravery onto young people. And so I would just encourage young people, that courage, that daringness, that bravery, to fight by any means necessary, to think outside the box, to believe that we can smash the patriarchy, to believe that we can eliminate that structure. Don't ever lose that. And don't let any adult sort of sap it out of you. And I also say that part of the reason why young people have that courage is because for them, the issue isn't the danger. The issue is what's right. And so for them, they recognize, okay, this is the right thing to do. So I'm going to do it despite the danger. The older we get, the more we're concerned about the danger, which then prevents us, right, from doing the right thing. And so I just would also encourage young people to have, to seep into that sort of courage. And indeed, we speak a lot about fear, and I think us older folks, we're like, man, those young people are fearless, right? But part of the reason for their fearlessness is because, now, fear is really a product of our imagination. Fear doesn't exist. Danger exists. But fear is a product of our imagination. And so young people, they recognize that. Right? And so I just, again, would encourage that, for our young people. And finally, I think that as it relates to politics, the younger we are, typically in this country, the more radical our politics. And so I would just also encourage young people to remember that it was that radical politic that was allowed us to end chattel slavery. It was that radical politic that smashed Jim Crow, and it will be that radical politic that abolishes racism.
Okay, we're back. And we're not going to get to chapter 8 tonight, I'm just telling you, because there's lots to talk about here. So what do you think?
Oh my God, wow. Where was the setting of that?
We were at General Synod at the Join the Movement dinner.
Okay, it was join
The first night, yep, at 7 o'clock. By the way, it's Join the Movement to End Racism, and it has its own website. It's affiliated with the UCC, but I sit on their advisory board, so. Yeah, and Margie, if you're talking, you're muted.
I really felt fortunate to be able to hear that. Ted had been an elected delegate to 2 synods, and there were just wonderful experiences. And I love to read, but to be able to hear him speak, I really appreciate that you brought that opportunity to us, because it was something I would have never had the opportunity to do. And I'm excited to talk about it with my friends.
Oh,
Yeah.
good, I'm glad. Yeah, he says it like it is, clearly.
I struggled with his perspective of liberation theology and savior theology.
Say more about that, Dennis.
I didn't recognize the savior theology in our world until he kind of defined it. And that is definitely an underpinning of some of the struggle within our congregation, all our congregations, but we don't recognize it.
No, it's inherited in the foundations of much of the white church. Our concept was that whoever we bring into the church, we are going to help save them from themselves. And in the case of the white church, with people of color and indigenous people, we absolutely needed to save them so they could become civilized like us. And it is the underneath. It's the piece that we don't talk about in church because we've just done church the way we've done church so long. And then we can't figure out why people don't want to come and be with us. Because we want them to come and be just like us, not just be with us.
And it also defines why the church can't change to accommodate people where they are.
The dog is agreeing, apparently.
It's like the meme that I saw that everybody wants change, but they don't want to change themselves. Yeah.
Well, and that's true, right?
Yeah.
And we like the passive Jesus because he doesn't push us to do anything. We're not so crazy about the revolutionary Jesus, who is pushing us to have our churches be the centers of fighting against injustice. That makes us much more uncomfortable.
I thought it was very telling in the confirmation classes that I led when I always included an African American congregation in part of their experience, even though I thought what we did was pretty lively. It's like not a chance. That when they saw Trinity Chicago, when they saw St. Luke's Community in Dallas,
Riverside.
Riverside, yeah, like their response was, why can't we have church like that?
Yeah.
And there's something about hearing Kendi describe the savior theology that just so resonated with me in a more evangelical, in the best sense of the word, tradition that, oh my God, this is what we were doing. And not having language or thought around that. I already sent you an email, Bonnie, like, how can we get access to this video to share it in our congregations, to have a forum, to create a conversation, do a dinner and video presentation and engage folks in conversation.
Well, our
This is
arrogance is
amazing.
not only with Black people. When I was a student in India, I would tell people that I was a student and they say, "You're not a professor?" They assumed that because I was white, I was there to teach, not to learn.
To learn, right?
Yeah.
And just that whole assumption that we have to save people means that we're not even going to take the time to learn anything about their spirituality,
Their culture even.
right? I mean, I had an opportunity to hear an Apache leader speak pre-pandemic, and he was speaking from his faith tradition and his spirituality. And I turned to the woman next to me, I said, he sounds like Gandhi. you know, and so why would we have to Christianize him?
Because, you know, because white Christians are better. Heck, you know that.
Well, I don't, I have big questions about that.
Well, and that, as Kendi says, that's the assimilationist attitude of racism, right? If we bring people in to be with us and we assimilate them into our way of being, thinking, acting, praying, worshiping, then they will be more successful like us, right? They will be like us. And there's a certain amount of, we want people to come in and be part of community. That's important. But I want you to come and be part of the community as who you are, not who we want to make you be. And so I thought his correlation of the African American church, the Black church, saying, oh, is this the box? Okay, we'll come and get inside the box and make the box our box, right? In a very different way than the expectations.
I had a college professor in my undergraduate work for history of world civilizations, and he introduced every religion on the same plane. And he also said all the religions and all good people, they're so similar. They have the golden rule or something similar to the 10 Commandments. And I was really so astonished at 19 to have it presented that way, when I always, I must confess, felt a little superior because I was a Christian.
Sure. Well, and we were taught that,
Yes.
right?
Mhm.
It was part of my becoming a baptized and confirmed Christian, was about becoming something better than those non-confirmed folks were. It wasn't true. I mean, it isn't true, but it's the basis of what we were taught. What else that he talked about hit you, touched you, made you want to go, yes, yes, yes? You could hear the people in the room, like, you know, it was like Black church service, sort of.
I think
Amen, say it. Go ahead.
the part that really touched me the most really was his conviction at the end that he has faith that justice will prevail, and he has faith in the young people. That was so hopeful for me to hear. And I think, you know, my only role now as an old man is how can I support young people as they march toward justice? How can I get out of the way, as he said?
Well, and I think he's right about their fearlessness, right? The young people I know do things because they think they're the right things to do, not because they're the safe things to do. And you're right. Sometimes we just got to get out of the way.
I got kind of teared up as he was talking about the young people, just thinking how much I wanted my 3 younger kids, especially, you know, all in their 20s, and, you know, thinking about them, it's like, I want this for them. I want them to have that kind of courage and boldness and hope. And, you know, that my 3 youngers are disconnected from the body politic and don't see any, you know, reason to engage in that. And, you know, they know how important that is to me. and it's like, oh God, I want them to hear him say this, you know, so it's not just coming from dad, you know.
Alan, you talked about getting out of their way. I think maybe what we need to do is get behind them and follow them. They need to know that we support them too.
Good point.
Right.
Yeah.
I thought his comments about the actions of the court were really insightful.
Yeah.
And the connection of all the bigotries together. And the fact that often what we do is we divide into our little sectors of groups that have to defend our own approach. Stop it. I'm sorry, the dog is attacking me. Our own, I'm going to be a feminist. I'm going to be an anti-racist. I'm going to be for queer rights. I'm going to be. And we lose the capacity to come together in solidarity, which is part of how our racial hierarchy and structures were born in the United States. I mean, there was a time when Black poor people and white poor people stood together against people who had, because they were the people who didn't. And then systems and policies were put in place to benefit the white poor people and make them feel better than the Black poor people. And it divided what would have been a solidarity movement. And I think we tend to do that in our culture. We tend to be for a particular passion of justice, which I think we all have to act on our passions, but we forget to come together because, there's a whole bunch of stuff we need to fight jointly.
To recognize that pitting of one poor group against another poor group is also intentional.
Of course. It's a divide and conquer mechanism.
Yeah, he didn't use the word, but when I was doing some of the organizing work in the Seattle area, the word intersectionality was always part of our vocabulary, in that we would almost be asking, like, so which protest are we going to today? It didn't matter, because the support of one was the support of all.
Who are we going to stand with against injustice? Becca.
And just, the climate crisis is one that impacts us all. And the people that are feeling it now are the people that have been oppressed for years. They're the ones that are on that are feeling it the most. As long as our air conditioning works, we can think that, well, this is not impacting us, but it's impacting, it's impacting all of us.
Absolutely. Not does it work or not, but that we can pay the bill.
Yeah. What else came up for anyone?
I like the way he unpacked the affirmative action piece. Because that resonates on a lot of different levels. From his perspective, it was about racism, but our society has evolved through so many generations that it impacts all races. Because today, if you are related to someone who went to that university, you get a boost.
Yep.
If you have a doctor in your family, you get a boost to medical school. Or if you're a lawyer, you have a boost to law school. That's an injustice for all the races.
Yep.
And it's not recognized. And he really unpacked that beautifully.
No, and we don't combat that, right? We combat the one thing that attempts to equalize part of the system.
Right.
Even though it doesn't actually equalize it, but makes an attempt, right? Because the legacies are still going to be the legacies, and the donors are still going to be the donors, and and the people with money are still going to be the people with money. But let's pretend we're leveling the playing field by taking away the one thing that allows people who are at the most disadvantaged to gain any advantage at all. Yeah.
That was hard to hear.
It was hard to hear. He's a scholar. I mean, that's why I think the point about the New York Times writer is so important to make, right? if you can't, and he said it, if you can't win an argument with someone, you discount them. So you can't win an argument with his scholarship around racism and anti-racism, assimilation, and segregationalism. You can't win that argument, so you discredit him as a scholar.
You make him a prophet. And I
Right.
thought that was interesting. Jesus was called a prophet too.
And by some people, a false one. Yeah,
I mean, that's,
Matt,
that's more or less the whole anti-woke movement in a nutshell, isn't it? It's,
Yeah.
I mean, labeling it wokeism in the first place is an attempt to delegitimize the scholarship that is behind it. So I
Yep.
think that that more or less sums up the whole anti-woke argument.
well, and I love his definition of the Moms for Liberty as the Daughters of the Confederacy.
I did.
Well, and he said the so-called moms.
Moms for Liberty.
Yeah.
And I love the connection, but they don't even really love white kids, right? Because assault weapons are still okay.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, he's so clear about his scholarship, about what he thinks, about what he believes, about how he thinks it. I keep saying I have to order his new book, and every time I go look for the new one, I can only find the hardcover one. So because I really appreciated Tracy's complimenting him on his ability to say, look, I used to say that. I won't say that now because I learned that this is a better way to express that. That even people who are really good at what they do can continue to learn how to be better. That seems really reasonable to me.
That's something that really impressed me as I've been reading the book, is that he has looked at himself and his thinking and his behavior and his terminology over time, and has worked to grow and change, and realizes that process is going to go on for the rest of his life.
Right.
And that really spoke to me and continues to speak to me whenever he puts those corrections in the book. And I actually have it in my Kindle, but I also listen to it on Audible, so I get to hear him as well read it, which is really nice as well.
I think, in the book, he comes across as really authentic, but seeing him in the interview was just, what you see is what you get. He just is so real and so straightforward. And how refreshing is that? Like,
oh gosh. Yeah, not putting on airs at all, right? I mean, let's answer a question. So I will.
and being clear about it, making sure that he hits all of the points up to where the answer, the foundation for the answer, and explaining. It's just amazing. I think he's an amazing person.
Yeah, he's a great speaker. He really is a great speaker. I actually bought the book Goodnight Racism. I actually read it at a couple of the Freedom School classes.
Oh.
So I did it once at Resurrected Life. And then I read it at the Easton Community Center last week. Last Thursday. I'm sorry, my dog is going a little bonkers here. And the concept of goodnight racism is to use good night as a metaphor for putting away something.
Oh.
So it starts out with the concept that the moon shines on all children, right? And it ends with saying, good night hate, good night injustice, good night racism. It says good night to the evils of the world as he closes the book. And I don't just go read to kids, I go and ask them questions. So the group at Easton had some older kids in it. And so I said, tell me what racism is. And I got some really interesting definitions. And then I said, he uses the expression good night as a metaphor. Does anybody know what a metaphor is? And the kids shared what they thought their definitions of metaphor were before we read the book. So I would recommend it. It's a really good book and it can be read for really young children because they would get it. And the illustrations are gorgeous, just gorgeous. So I would recommend it for children's time.
And of course, that title comes from the classic Goodnight Moon.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
So it's a wonderful book. I haven't read Anti-Racist Baby, but because when he mentioned Goodnight Racism, I thought, oh, I gotta get that one. So I did.
I was
Go ahead.
impressed with the depth of his sensitivity, because when he was talking about no longer using the word crazy. And I'm still working on that, because that word is a part of my vocabulary, and I use it without thinking, and yeah.
Velda Love, who asked the question about the young people. She's the director of the Join the Movement portion of the UCC movement. And you heard Tracy allude to the book about the fifth stream.
Yes.
For years and years and years in polity circles, we have utilized that the UCC came from four streams: the evangelical, the reformed, the congregational, and the Christian. There is a fifth stream. The Afro-Christian Convention was a part of the movement that came into the United Church of Christ, but as wont to do, we combined it with the Christian church. And so Velda has done a lot of research, and she has a new book out on the Afro-Christian Convention. And so polity teachers are beginning to now, when we teach polity and talk about polity, to talk about the 5 streams that are the United Church of Christ, not the 4. It's not a heavy read, and it's reasonable. So if you're intrigued with formation of the UCC, as many of us are, you might want to get a hold of it. It's a good resource. And again, in a church that struggles to be anti-racist, we have our own racist history that we attempt to dismantle, right? So we attempt to dismantle it by making sure that we're talking now about the church we discounted before. We continue to try to dismantle our part of the American Indian boarding school movement. We continue to try to untie ourselves and correct the behaviors that we as a denomination and our antecedent denominations, those racist, sexist acts that we committed as a church. Again, learning, right? We keep learning, try to do it better.
And I'm just thinking about, is there a way to share with our congregations what we're learning as a denomination?
Isn't that a great idea? The answer to that question is yes. We just have to figure out how to do it. So, Steve, in answer to your question, I already contacted the Frontline Faith people to see how broadly we can share this resource. Obviously, I have recorded this entire meeting, which means that is recorded in the recording. However, I don't want us to share it without permission to do so. Originally, the intent was the people who went to the Join the Movement dinner could purchase the recording for $34, which I did so that we could share. It appears if you go to Frontline Faith, which is part of the UCC, you can purchase, if you have to enroll in Frontline Faith, but you can purchase this. It appears you get to purchase this recording of this panel conversation. You can request the Valerie Russell Luncheon where Brian Stevenson was also the speaker. Just Mercy, Equal Rights Initiative, Equal Justice Initiative, I'm sorry. So you may actually be able to purchase them yourself. I don't know that for sure, because originally it was the people who paid to go to the meals who could do it, but.
I've seen in emails from the UCC that we can purchase them. I think
So
they're like $35 or something.
Yeah, they're like $34 a piece. So what I would say to you is, if you're interested in sharing them with your church or with a book study group, or that you be in touch with the Frontline Faith people. That's what I did. I got in touch with Frontline Faith and said, we're doing this as a book study. How can we share this more broadly? Because I don't want to abuse our access to it. That feels like cheating and sort of unethical to me. But I also want you to be able to utilize it, because as I said, we want everybody to learn the same kind of things we're learning. And as for the Fifth Stream book, one of the things the Polity Teachers Network is looking at is creating an outline on UCC polity that we can provide to pastors to share with their congregations. So there may actually be an outline for that as well. So, we'll just keep our mind moving forward.
There's a discussion coming up on that, a discussion group.
Yep.
Laura's leading it.
Yep. And for all of you who, think we never hear anything after the resolutions get passed at General Synod, we're inviting delegates to be part of conversations about how to implement conversations about the resolutions, so that they're not forgotten. All right, it is 8:31. I'm trying to honor our time. We do not meet next week. When we meet on what would be the 6th of August? I don't know what day that would be.
The 8th.
The 8th of August. I can only read July on my calendar. When we meet on the 8th of August, we will do chapter 8 and 9, perhaps. I know we'll do chapter 8. The question is, will we get into chapter 9? So I will send you the recordings, have Patty send you the recordings. I would ask you not to broadly share the Kendi panel discussion, but it may help you to listen to it again, to again get more of the meat of the conversation. Questions? Thank you. I'm glad we were able to do this, and I'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Have a good vacation.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.